You can't read that. Marcus Thorne sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. The waitress froze her tray, trembling just slightly. The contract on the table shimmered under the amber light, ancient vellum inked in a language the billionaire believed extinct. Around them, crystal glasses chimed and whispered wealth, but Clara's eyes locked on the runes. She knew them. Every line, every word her late grandfather had once taught her. Thorne thought he was sealing a deal. He was in fact signing his own ruin, and the invisible woman standing beside him was about to make history remember her name. You can't read that. Marcus Thorne sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. The waitress froze her tray, trembling just slightly. The contract on the table shimmered under the amber light, ancient vellum inked in a language the billionaire believed extinct. Around them, crystal glasses chimed and whispered wealth, but Clara's eyes locked on the runes. She knew them. Every line, every word her late grandfather had once taught her. Thorne thought he was sealing a deal. He was, in fact, signing his own ruin, and the invisible woman standing beside him was about to make history remember her name. The air in Aurelian, a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a sign, was thick with the scent of money and seared scallops. It was a calculated atmosphere designed to make patrons feel both supremely important and acutely aware of their own insignificance if they didn't belong. For Clara Vance, it was just her workplace. For the past 3 years, it had been the gilded cage where she earned the money that kept her sister Sophie alive. Each night, Clara moved through the labyrinth of tables with a practiced, almost spectral grace. She was 28, but felt 100. The fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes were testament to 16-hour days, 8 at the restaurant, and another 8 before and after tending to Sophie, managing medications and fighting with insurance companies. Her hands, though steady as she poured a 1982 Bordeaux for a hedge fund manager, were calloused from tasks far removed from Aurelian's velvet-draped walls. Tonight, the restaurant's oppressive silence was amplified. Table 12, the most private booth with a commanding view of the city skyline, had been booked by Marcus Thorne, the CEO of Apex Global Acquisitions. Thorne was a legend on Wall Street, a corporate raider known for his ruthlessness. A man who didn't just acquire companies, he consumed them, leaving nothing but shareholder profits and hollowed-out communities in his wake. Clara knew the type. She'd served dozens like him. They all shared the same look, a predatory gleam in their eyes, a sense of entitlement so profound it was like a physical aura. They treated the staff as furniture that could talk. Thorne, however, was in a class of his own. He didn't just ignore her. He looked through her, his gaze sweeping past as if she were a column of air. He was flanked by 2 lawyers, sharp-suited men named Peterson and Graves, who mirrored his icy demeanor. "The old man should be here any minute," Thorne grumbled, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on his phone screen. "Let's hope he hasn't forgotten how to use a taxi." Peterson chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "He'll be here, Marcus. He has no choice. The estate is bleeding him dry." Clara placed a basket of sourdough, still warm from the oven, on the table. No one acknowledged her. She was just a pair of hands. As she retreated, she overheard Thorne's next comment, a sliver of ice in his voice. "This is the final piece of the puzzle. Once we have the Sterling coastline, the entire Northern Sound project is greenlit. We'll build a resort that will make Monaco look like a public beach." His voice dripped with avarice, and all it costs is the pride of some geriatric fool clinging to a pile of rocks his ancestors pillaged from someone else. The word snagged in Clara Ara's mind. Sterling. The name was familiar, but she couldn't place it. Her mind was a Rolodex of pharmaceutical names and treatment schedules for Sophie's rare autoimmune disease. There was little room for anything else. Her grandfather would have known. Before he passed, Professor Alistair Vance had been a world-renowned paleographer and historian at Columbia, specializing in ancient Germanic and Norse legal traditions. His apartment, which Clara Ara had painstakingly packed up after his death, was a fortress of forgotten languages and dusty tomes. He had spent hours teaching her not just the languages themselves, but the culture and mindset behind them. He'd unroll facsimiles of ancient deeds on the dining room table, his long, bony finger tracing the intricate runic-inspired lettering. Language isn't just words. Clara, he'd say, his eyes twinkling behind thick glasses. It's a key. It unlocks the way people thought, how they loved, how they fought, and most importantly, how they bound each other with promises. A modern contract is a weapon, an ancient one. That was a soul pact. Clara Ara had inherited his gift for languages, a photographic memory for script and syntax. It was a useless talent she'd thought bitterly for a woman whose life revolved around tips and Sophie's next infusion. Her dreams of academia had died with her parents in a car crash a decade ago, leaving her as Sophie's sole guardian. The professorships and research grants had been replaced by the urgent calculus of survival. Just then the host led an elderly man toward table 12. He was tall and frail, with a shock of white hair and a face etched with a quiet, weary dignity. He wore a tweed jacket that had seen better decades, and he leaned heavily on a wooden cane. This had to be Mr. Sterling. He looked utterly out of place, a relic from a bygone era in a room full of digital predators. Thorne didn't stand. He gestured to the seat opposite him with a flick of his wrist. "Sterling, glad you could make it. Time is money, and you're costing me a fortune." Mr. Sterling slowly lowered himself into the chair. "Mr. Thorne, it is a significant journey for me and a significant decision." "The decision is made," Thorne said flatly. "We're here for the formalities. My lawyers have the final paperwork." "Graves." The younger lawyer pushed a thick, leather-bound document to the center of the table. It wasn't paper. Clara noted from a distance as she refilled water glasses at the adjacent table. It looked like vellum. The script on the cover was not modern English. It was an elegant, angular calligraphy that made the hairs on Clara's arms stand up. She felt a jolt, a flicker of recognition so intense it was like a physical shock. It was a script her grandfather had shown her 100 times. A specific regional variant of Old Norse law, speak from the Northern Isles, used exclusively for land covenants in the 11th and 12th centuries. It was notoriously difficult, a hybrid of runic law and early Christian legal frameworks. There were maybe 5 people in the world who could read it fluently. Her grandfather had been one, and as he had drilled into her for years, she was another. As we discussed Peterson, the lawyer began, his voice a condescending drone. "This is a simple transference of title for the 400 acres of coastal land known as Sterling Headland. In exchange, Apex Global will settle the estate's debts and provide you with a lifelong annuity." Mr. Sterling stared at the document, his brow furrowed. "The original deed, my family's lawyers, they said it had to be this way. Something about the land charter being unbreakable. It had to be signed in its original form." Thorne smirked a wolfish, predatory grin. "Quaint, isn't it, some historical nonsense? We had to fly in a specialist from Oslo just to draft the addendums in this chicken scratch. Cost a fortune. But if it makes you feel better about selling off your family's legacy, so be it." Clara Ara froze. Her duties, the other tables, the oppressive atmosphere of the restaurant, it all faded away. The only thing in the world was that document and the lie she had just heard. A specialist from Oslo to draft an addendum. You couldn't just draft an addendum to a document like that. The legal and linguistic structures were hermetically sealed. Changing a single clause would require reconsecrating the entire text under principles that hadn't been practiced for 900 years. Thorne wasn't just being arrogant. He was lying, but why she needed to get closer. Finding a need to check on their breadbasket, she approached the table, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her eyes darted to the vellum. The script was even clearer now. She could read the heading perfectly. The Land Covenant for Sterling Headland. And below it, in a slightly different hand, a subclause. Her breath hitched. She could make out a few key words: ransom or redemption price, and a final chilling phrase: guardian of the law. Her mind raced, connecting the dots her grandfather had laid out for her years ago. These weren't just land deeds. They were dynastic traps filled with clauses and subclauses designed to protect the land for the bloodline against all comers. A redemption price wasn't a sale price. It was a fee paid to temporarily suspend the rights of the owner rights that could snap back into place if conditions were met, and the guardian of the law that was a third party and arbiter. Thorne was not buying this land. He was leasing it under a set of conditions he clearly didn't understand. Mr. Sterling looked at the complex lettering, his face a mask of confusion and resignation. He was being swindled and he didn't even know it. He was a sheep being led to a slaughter he thought was a green pasture. Thorne saw the old man's hesitation. With a sigh of theatrical impatience, he leaned forward. "Look, it's all boilerplate, historical mumbo-jumbo. It says, 'I own the land. You get your money. Simple.'" He gestured vaguely at the waitress who happened to be standing nearby, a mere fixture in the room. He looked at Clara Ara, but not at her. He saw a black apron and a tray, and then he said the words that would change everything. With a contemptuous sneer aimed at the ancient text, and by extension at Mr. Sterling's heritage, he waved a dismissive hand. "It's not like anyone in this room can even read it. You can't read that." The sneer was universal, but his eyes had briefly flicked to Clara as he said it, including her in his circle of contempt for the uninitiated, the unimportant. The insult was not just to Mr. Sterling, but to her, to her grandfather, to the knowledge he had so lovingly passed down. In that instant, something inside Clara shifted. The years of quiet desperation, of swallowing her pride, of being invisible, coalesced into a single sharp point of defiance. She was no longer just a waitress. She was Allister Vance's granddaughter. She had a choice. Stay silent, collect her meager tip, and go home to Sophie's quiet suffering. Or she could light a match in this room full of gasoline. She straightened her shoulders, placing her empty tray on a nearby stand. The weight of whispers in the room suddenly felt insignificant compared to the weight of the words on that page. She took a breath and stepped forward. Clara Ara's movement was so unexpected that it momentarily broke the tableau. For a second, Marcus Thorne and his lawyers seemed to think she was merely reaching for an empty glass. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but carried the clear, resonant timbre of absolute certainty. Actually, she said, her eyes fixed on the vellum document, "I can." The silence that followed was not the hushed, reverent quiet of an expensive restaurant. It was a dead, suffocating vacuum. 4 pairs of eyes swiveled to face her. Mr. Sterling looked bewildered. Peterson and Graves. The lawyers stared with open-mouthed astonishment as if a chair had just spoken. Marcus Thorne's face went through a rapid series of micro-expressions, surprise, annoyance, and finally incredulous amusement. A low, condescending chuckle rumbled in his chest. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice dripping with saccharine poison. "What did you say? I said I can read it?" Clara Ara repeated, stepping closer to the table. She pointed a steady finger at the heading. "The land covenant for Sterling Headland established in the year of our Lord 1088, under the seal of Jarl Håkon Magnus." The specificity of her statement wiped the smirk off Thorne's face. The amusement was gone, replaced by a dark, gathering storm of fury. "Who the hell are you? My name is Clara Ara Vance. I'm your waitress for the evening." She met his glare without flinching. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her voice was as calm as a frozen lake. Years of dealing with condescending doctors and emotionless insurance agents had forged an armor of steel around her nerves. "Get away from my table," Thorne hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "Now, Mr. Thorne." Mr. Sterling interjected, his voice quavering slightly, but with a newfound spark of interest. He turned to Clara. "Young lady, are you certain this is a very old and specific dialect? Its law speak Norse from the Orkine school." Clara replied, her gaze still locked with Thorne's. It's characterized by its use of kennings for legal concepts and its strict alliterative structure in binding clauses. For instance, she leaned closer, her finger tracing a line of script. This section here is the shield of ownership. It doesn't grant ownership in perpetuity. It grants stewardship contingent upon upholding the traditions of the land. Peterson, the senior lawyer, finally found his voice. He gave a forced, incredulous laugh. That's preposterous. She's making it up. She probably saw a documentary on Vikings. Marcus, let me call security. Wait, Mr. Sterling said, raising a hand. He looked at Clara, his old eyes searching her face. The traditions of the land. What does that mean? Thorne slammed his palm on the table, making the silverware jump. Enough. This is a private business meeting. You are fired. Get your things and get out of my sight before I have you arrested for corporate espionage. The threat was absurd, but it was meant to intimidate, to crush her back into the silent, invisible role she was supposed to occupy, but Clara Ara had already stepped over the line. There was no going back. Corporate espionage. Clara Ara counted a hint of ice in her own voice. Now is that what you call it when someone points out the lies in a contract you're trying to force on an elderly man? You said you flew in a specialist from Oslo to draft addendums. She looked at the two lawyers. You're his legal counsel. You must know that any addendum to a document of this nature would have to be written on a separate and consecrated with witnesses of landed status. There is no such addendum here. This document is sealed and singular. You haven't added anything. You're simply hoping Mr. Sterling can't read the parts you don't want him to see. Graves. The younger lawyer went pale. Peterson's jaw tightened. They knew she was right. Their entire strategy depended on ignorance, theirs and Mr. Sterling's. They had likely paid their specialist a hefty sum simply to tell them the document was ironclad, and then gambled that no one else on earth would ever be able to verify it. Thorne rose from his seat, a towering figure of rage. He was used to controlling every room he entered, every variable in every deal. Clara was an anomaly. He couldn't process a waitress who spoke like a tenure professor. I don't know what little game you're playing, he snarled, pointing a trembling finger at her. But it's over. The game is yours, Mr. Thorne, Clara said calmly, and you're about to lose. Mr. Sterling, may I? She gestured to the document. The old man hesitated for a moment, looking from Thorne's furious face to Clara's impossibly serene one. He saw the desperation and the lies in the CEO's eyes, and he saw something else in the waitress's, something true. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Please continue. Thorne looked as if he was about to physically drag Clara away from the table, but the restaurant manager, a perpetually nervous man named Jeffrey, was now hovering nearby, drawn by the commotion. A scene was the last thing Aurelian's management wanted. Thorne was trapped by the very decorum he used as a weapon. With a deep breath, Clara rested her fingertips on the cool, ancient vellum. The touch was electric, a connection across 1,000 years. It felt like her grandfather's hand on her shoulder. The first few sections are standard for the period she began her voice, taking on a more academic, assured tone. They established the lineage of the Sterling clan, the divine right of their claim to the headland, and the boundaries of the property marked by standing stones and the high tide line on the day of the summer solstice. She scanned the text, her eyes flying across the intricate letters. It speaks of the duties of the steward to maintain the cairns of the ancestors, to allow the local fishermen access to the cove for shelter during storms, and to leave a tithe of grain for the wild birds in winter. These are the traditions of the land. Failure to uphold them is considered a breach. That's folklore, not law. Peterson scoffed, though his voice lacked conviction. In the 11th century, there was no difference. Clara Ara retorted without looking at him. A promise to the land was a promise to God. A breach wasn't just a civil matter. It was a mortal sin that invalidated the agreement. But that's not the most important part. Her finger stopped on a densely written paragraph near the bottom of the page, just above the space for the signatures and seals. "Here it is," she whispered almost to herself. "The Heritage Clause." She looked up at Mr. Sterling. "Sir, this contract doesn't allow for the sale of the land. Not in the way we understand it. You, as the blood, can grant a custodial gift to an outsider for a period of 99 years. In exchange for this gift, the custodian, in this case Apex Global, pays a redemption price to you." "That's the annuity," Graves muttered, staring at the page as if seeing a ghost. "Yes," Clara Ara confirmed. "But the word redemption is key. It implies the land is being held captive and can be redeemed. The clause states that if the custodian, Mr. Thorne, fails to uphold any of the traditions I mentioned, or if he attempts to desecrate the soil with structures not in harmony with the landscape, which I imagine a resort that makes Monaco look like a public beach, would qualify as the custodial gift, is immediately voided." Thorne's face had become a mask of cold white fury. The blood had drained from it, leaving his eyes looking like chips of obsidian. Clara took another deep breath before delivering the final devastating blow. "And it says that upon the breach of contract, the land and all permanent structures built upon it, every hotel, every golf course, every swimming pool, do not revert to you, Mr. Sterling." She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle in the silent room. "They are forfeit. They become the property of the one who identifies the breach and guards the covenant, the property of the guardian of the law." She looked from the text to the three men, Thorne, Peterson, and Graves. They hadn't just misread the contract. They had willingly walked into a 1,000-year-old legal bear trap. They thought they were buying a priceless piece of coastline. In reality, they were about to pay Mr. Sterling an annuity for the privilege of building a multi-billion-dollar resort that the moment they broke ground would be legally seized by someone else. They were funding their own destruction. And the sneering CEO had no idea how much deeper his problems were about to become. The revelation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The low hum of the restaurant, the distant clink of glasses, the city lights twinkling outside the window. It all seemed to belong to a different reality. At table 12, a chasm had opened spanning 10 centuries. Marcus Thorne stood frozen, his face a canvas of disbelief, wearing with dawning horror. The sheer magnificent audacity of the 11th century Norse lawyers who had drafted this document was something his 21st century mind, accustomed to loopholes written in microscopic print, could barely comprehend. This wasn't a loophole. It was a fortress, and he had just tried to storm it with a plastic battering ram. That's impossible," Peterson stammered. His legalistic composure shattered. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. No court in the world would uphold such an archaic, a barbaric clause. Wouldn't they? Clara Ara's voice was steady. "The United Kingdom, and by extension its historical territories in the Northern Isles, has a legal system built on precedent. The Sterling Headland Charter predates the Magna Carta. It has never been legally challenged or superseded. It's not just a contract. It's a foundational document. Your own legal team advised Mr. Sterling it was unbreakable. That's why you're here with this vellum and not a modern printout? You knew it was binding. You just didn't bother to understand what it bound you to." Mr. Sterling stared at Clara, his expression one of profound, soul-shaking awe. He looked down at his trembling hands, then at the document that had been his family's burden for generations. He had seen it as a chain, a relic, that tied him to a patch of rock and wind while his fortunes dwindled. For the first time, he was seeing it as his ancestors had intended a shield. The guardian of the law, he murmured the words tasting foreign on his tongue. "Who is this guardian?" Thorne finally broke his silence. His voice was dangerously soft, the calm at the eye of a hurricane. "This is a shakedown, a conspiracy. You too?" He jabbed a finger between Clara and Mr. Sterling, cooked this up. "The folksy old landowner and the bookworm waitress. It's a pathetic little scam." Clara almost laughed. The arrogance was so complete, so all-encompassing, that he couldn't fathom being beaten by history and intelligence. It had to be a plot aimed at him personally. A scam I orchestrated from my position serving you lukewarm bread, Mr. Thorne. A scam that required me to spend years learning a dead language on the off chance you'd one day try to swindle a man I'd never met in the restaurant where I worked to pay for my sister's medical bills. The details of her life tumbled out, each one a small, sharp stone thrown at his absurd accusation. Believe me, my life isn't nearly that interesting. Her words, so plain and raw, cut through the tension with the sting of truth. Jeffrey, the manager, who had been inching closer, now stood stock still, his face a mixture of fear and fascination. The story was unfolding, and it was far grander than a simple customer complaint. Clara turned her attention back to the vellum, her focus absolute. She wasn't finished. There was one more piece, one final, exquisitely crafted mechanism in the ancient legal machine. Her grandfather had always told her that these old law writers never left things to chance. They planned for everything: greed, ignorance, betrayal, and even the passage of time itself. The guardian of the law, she explained, her voice dropping slightly. Drawing them in is not a preordained person or a member of Mr. Sterling's family. The covenant is clear. The bloodline are the protectors of the land, but the law itself needs a different kind of guardian. She scanned the final lines of the clause, her lips moving silently as she translated the dense poetic legal verse. The guardian is defined as the one with the wisdom to read the runes of right, the voice to speak the truth of the script, and the courage to stand against the shadow of the oathbreaker. It's a role to be filled, not inherited. So who is it, Graves asked, his legal mind trying to grasp at a tangible entity. Who gets the resort? Clara looked up from the page. She met Marcus Thorne's burning glare, then the questioning eyes of the lawyers, and finally the hopeful, fearful gaze of Mr. Sterling. It's not just about identifying the breach, she said, slowly ensuring every word landed with the force of a hammer blow. The covenant was designed to protect the Sterling legacy against powerful men exactly like you, Mr. Thorne. Men who would use force or wealth to bend the law. The drafters knew that in the centuries to come their language might be forgotten, their intentions obscured. The legacy would be vulnerable. So they built in a fail-safe, a reward, a motivation to ensure that someone would always have a reason to learn this language, to study this law, to protect this covenant. She took a half step back from the table, creating a small, clear space between herself and the combatants. She was no longer just a participant. She was the orbiter, the judge, the interpreter's endowment. Has a second part. She paused. A new cold dread began to creep into Thorne's eyes, a fear that went beyond the loss of a deal. This was the fear of total annihilation. Clara continued, her voice resonating with the weight of the ancient words she was channeling. It states that the person who successfully interprets the covenant for a blood heir in the face of a deliberate deception, the one who becomes the guardian by their action, is entitled to a portion of the very price being used to subvert the covenant. They are to be awarded a tithe of the ransom. Peterson and Graves exchanged a horrified look. They had structured the redemption price not as a simple lump sum, but as a complex, massive annuity backed by Apex Global's capital assets designed to pay out over Mr. Sterling's lifetime. It was valued in total at $10 million, 10%, $1 million. The number hung in the air, glittering and deadly, a life-changing sum of money for anyone. But for Clara, it was more. It was Sophie's future. It was freedom from the crushing weight of debt. It was a lifeline thrown across a chasm of despair. Thorne finally understood. The trap had not one but two sets of jaws. The first would snap shut on his multi-billion-dollar project. The second would clamp down on his company's liquid assets. And the trigger for both was the waitress he had dismissed without a second thought. He made a strangled, guttural sound, a mixture of a gasp and a roar. No, it's a trick, a forgery. Is it? Clara challenged, her voice ringing with newfound power. Mr. Graves, you're holding a pen. Mr. Sterling, according to this, your signature must be made with it here. She pointed to a space at the bottom. "And the custodian, Mr. Thorne, must affix his corporate seal here, using his own signet ring dipped in wax. Tell me, Mr. Thorne, did you bring your ring, the one with the Apex Global logo? Because the covenant specifically describes the process. It seems your specialist did a very thorough job of telling you exactly how to spring the trap on yourself." Thorne instinctively touched the heavy gold ring on his right hand. The blood drained completely from his face. He had been so proud of that ostentatious piece of jewelry, a symbol of his power. Now it was just another part of his own undoing. He had been meticulously led into a labyrinth designed a millennium ago, and the person holding the map was the one he'd sneered at for not being able to read the sign at the entrance. Clara looked at Mr. Sterling, her expression softening. "Sir, this document ensures that your family's land can never be sold or permanently altered. You can accept Mr. Thorne's annuity. And if he so much as digs a foundation for a hotel, his project and the land revert to a trust managed in your family's name, overseen by a guardian me who is legally bound and financially incentivized to protect it. Or you can refuse his offer and he can walk away, having lost nothing but his time and his pride." The choice was Mr. Sterling's, but it wasn't a choice at all. It was a checkmate. Thorne sank back into his chair, his immense frame seeming to shrink. The predator had become the prey. He stared at Clara Ara, and for the first time he truly saw her. He saw the intelligence in her clear gray eyes, the iron in her spine, the quiet, devastating power she wielded. And he understood that he had just made the most expensive mistake of his entire life. He hadn't just misjudged a document, he had catastrophically misjudged a human being. The immediate aftermath at Table 12 was a deafening silence, punctuated only by the sound of Marcus Thorne's ragged breathing. The universe had been reordered in the span of 10 minutes. Power had shifted not with the crash of a market or the signing of a deal, but with the translation of a forgotten language. Thorne's lawyers were in disarray. Graves was frantically typing into his phone, likely searching for any precedent, any loophole that could negate a 1,000-year-old covenant. Peterson just stared blankly at the vellum, his face ashen, the face of a man who sees his career, his reputation, and his hefty commission all dissolving into dust. It was Mr. Sterling who finally acted. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping softly on the polished floor. He stood up, and though he still leaned on his cane, he seemed taller, straighter. The weariness in his face had been replaced by a resolve that felt as ancient as the document on the table. "I believe," he said, his voice clear and firm, "that this meeting is concluded. Mr. Thorne, your offer as it stands is an insult to my ancestors and an attempt at brazen theft. You will not be hearing from me again." He then turned to Clara, his eyes shining with unshed tears of gratitude. "Miss Vance, I find myself utterly in your debt. I don't know how to." "You owe me nothing," Sir Clara said gently. "I just translated the words." The strength was already there. Perhaps he nodded slowly. "Nevertheless, I would be honored if you would allow me and my solicitor to contact you tomorrow. There is much to discuss." He handed her a simple, elegant business card from his worn wallet. It read only William Sterling and a phone number. With a final withering look at Marcus Thorne, William Sterling turned and walked away. He moved not like a frail old man, but like a king reclaiming his throne, his cane tapping a steady, victorious rhythm on the floor. As soon as he was gone, Thorne's composure finally spectacularly shattered. He lunged to his feet, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. "You," he roared, his voice echoing through the now silent restaurant. All eyes were on their table. "You think you've won. You think you can humiliate me. I will destroy you. I will bury you in litigation until you and your sick sister are begging on the street. I will find every skeleton in your closet and hang it on a billboard. You are nothing." The mention of Sophie was a blow, a vile targeted strike meant to wound her where she was most vulnerable. but it had the opposite effect. It extinguished the last flicker of fear in Clara's heart and replaced it with cold, hard fury. "You're right, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "I am nothing. I'm just a waitress. But you're not fighting me. You're fighting a 12th century Yale, 10 generations of starings, and the entire legal history of the British Isles. Your threats are meaningless. You have no power here." She leaned in slightly. "And if you ever mention my sister again, you'll discover that I know the Old Norse words for blood feud, too." The raw intensity of her threat, so alien and archaic, stunned him into silence. He stared at her, breathing heavily, and for a moment he looked almost afraid. "Geoffrey," the manager finally scurried over. "Mr. Thorne, sir, please, we must maintain." "Shut up," Geoffrey Thorne snapped, turning his rage on the easiest target. He threw a black credit card on the table. "Cover the bill. We're leaving." He stormed out of the restaurant, Peterson and Graves scrambling in his wake like hyenas chasing a wounded lion. The air at the table slowly began to normalize, the oppressive weight of his presence lifting. Clara stood there for a long moment, her body trembling with adrenaline. Then her legs felt weak. She sank into the chair Thorne had just vacated. It was over. She had done it. Miss Vance Geoffrey said, his voice a nervous squeak. Are you all right? What just happened?" Clara looked at her boss, the man who knew her only as a reliable employee who never called in sick. "I think," she said with a shaky, exhausted smile, "I quit." The next few days were a blur. The story, as Thorne had feared, did not remain within the velvet walls of Aurelian. One of the other patrons, a notorious financial blogger, had overheard enough of the confrontation. The headline on his site the next morning was "Explosive Apex CEO Thorne, Humiliated by Waitress and 1,000-year-old Contract." The story went viral. The financial world, which ran on confidence and reputation, was merciless. Thorne, the invincible shark, had been outmaneuvered not by a corporate rival, but by a waitress and a medieval document. It was a story too perfect, too full of hubris and comeuppance to ignore. Apex Global stock began to slide. Then it began to plummet. Investors, already jittery about the massive capital expenditure for the Northern Sound project, panicked. The project was dead. Thorne's reputation was in tatters, and the company's leadership was suddenly seen as incompetent and reckless. The board of directors convened an emergency meeting. Meanwhile, Clara Ara had met with William Sterling and his solicitor, a sharp, kind woman named Nina Finch. They met not in a stuffy office, but in the quiet, book-lined study of Mr. Sterling's modest city apartment. Eleanor had already had the covenant verified by a team of academics from Oxford and Cambridge. Their verdict was unanimous. It was legally unassailable. Clara Ara's translation and interpretation were, in their words, flawless and brilliant. "Mr. Thorne's lawyers have been in contact." Eleanor said, her glasses perched on the end of her nose. "They are, to put it mildly, desperate. First, they tried threats. When that didn't work, they tried offers. They're prepared to offer you a substantial sum to sign a non-disclosure agreement and waive your claim as the guardian." Clara Ara looked at Mr. Sterling. "What do you want to do, sir?" "For the first time in my life, I am not thinking about money," he said, a genuine smile gracing his features. "I am thinking of the wind on the headland. I am thinking of my grandfather teaching me the names of the seabirds. That land is not for sale. It is not for lease. It is not for negotiation. It is my family's soul, and you, my dear, have saved it." The decision was made. Eleanor sent a crisp, formal rejection of all offers. 2 days later, the news broke that Marcus Thorne had been forced to resign as CEO of Apex Global Acquisitions. The company was facing multiple shareholder lawsuits and an SEC investigation into his handling of the deal. His empire, built on intimidation and arrogance, had unraveled because of it. That afternoon, a certified check arrived at Clara Ara's small apartment via courier. It was from a trust account set up by Ellen Finch. The check was made out to Clara Vance. The amount was for $1,000. Clara Ara stared at it, her hands shaking. It was an impossible sum, a number she had only ever seen in the context of Sophie's projected lifetime medical costs. She sat on her worn-out sofa, the sounds of the city traffic outside her window seeming distant and muffled. She thought of the countless nights she had spent awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how she would make it through another month, another year. Sophie came out of her room wrapped in a blanket, her face pale but her eyes bright. "What's that, Clara?" Clara couldn't speak. She just handed the check to her younger sister. Sophie's eyes widened. She looked up at Clara Ara, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. Is this real?" Clara Ara finally found her voice, a tear tracing a path down her tired cheek. "It's real, Soph," she whispered, pulling her sister into a fierce hug. "It's real. You're going to get the best doctors, the best treatments. You're going to get better." In her hand, she still clutched the simple business card William Sterling had given her. It felt heavier now, like a key. It wasn't just a phone number. It was a link to a new life, a life she had earned not with a tray and an apron, but with her mind, her courage, and the enduring legacy of her grandfather's love. The weight of whispers had been lifted, replaced by the promise of a future she had dared not even dream of. Wealth, Clara discovered, was not a destination. It was a tool. And in the weeks following her life-altering night at Aurelion, she wielded it with the precision of a surgeon. The first and most important task was Sophie. Armed with the $1 million, Clara was no longer at the mercy of insurance company bureaucracy and overworked public health physicians. She secured a consultation with Dr. Annabelle Reed, a leading immunologist, at a private research hospital in Boston. They flew there on a commercial flight first class, a small luxury Clara insisted on, and for the first time, Sophie was seen not as a collection of symptoms or a case file, but as a person. Dr. A. Reed spent 2 hours with them reviewing Sophie's history, asking questions Clara had never been asked before about her sister's energy levels, her mood, her hopes. She proposed a new experimental treatment plan, one that was prohibitively expensive and therefore never offered to patients on standard insurance plans. It wasn't a guaranteed cure, but it offered something Clara hadn't had in years, a credible scientific basis for hope. With this regimen, Dr. Reed explained, her voice calm and compassionate. "We're not just managing the symptoms. We're aiming to reboot her immune system. The goal is long-term remission. The cost was astronomical, $250,000 for the first year alone." A younger, poorer Clara would have despaired. The new Clara simply nodded and asked where to wire the funds. Watching the relief wash over Sophie's face, seeing the faint spark of her old, vibrant self return to her eyes, was worth every single penny. It was the sound of chains breaking. While Sophie began her treatment, Clara turned her attention to the rest of their lives. She paid off the mountain of medical debt they had accumulated, the letters with angry red warnings ceasing to arrive for the first time in her adult life. She hired a financial advisor, a sensible woman, who helped her invest the remaining sum wisely, ensuring it would grow and provide for them for years to come. She sold their cramped, drafty apartment and bought a bright, airy condominium in a quiet building with a small garden, a place where Sophie could sit in the sun without being overwhelmed by city noise. But as the immediate crisis were resolved, Clara found herself with something she hadn't experienced since her parents died: time. Free from the relentless 16-hour days, she had space to think, to reflect. The money had solved her problems, but it hadn't given her a purpose. That purpose arrived in the form of a thick package from William Sterling. Inside was not legal paperwork, but a collection of high-quality photographs of the Sterling headland. Clara spread them out on her new dining room table. She saw rugged cliffs plunging into a turquoise sea, a crescent of white sand in a sheltered cove, and rolling green hills dotted with wildflowers and ancient moss-covered standing stones. It was a place of breathtaking primeval beauty. There was also a handwritten letter. "My dear Clara, I hope this finds you and your sister well. Eleanor keeps me apprised of Mr. Thorne's spectacular corporate demise, which I must admit brings a grim satisfaction. But I write to you today not about him, but about the future. You are now, by ancient law and modern agreement, the Verd Elmalans, the guardian of the law of this land. It is a role with responsibilities as you so eloquently explained. I propose we form a trust, the Sterling Headland Preservation Trust. Its sole mission will be to protect this land in perpetuity, to fund research into its unique ecology and history, and to ensure it remains a sanctuary unspoiled by the greed that nearly consumed it. I wish to seed the trust with a significant donation, but it needs a director. It needs a heart. It needs its guardian. I can think of no one more qualified or more deserving than you. Please consider it. Yours in gratitude, William Sterling." Clara Ara stared at the letter, her heart swelling. This was it. This was the purpose she had been looking for. It was a role that honored her past and secured her future. It was a job only she could do, a position created for her by history itself. She thought of her grandfather, Professor Alistair Vance. He had spent his life trying to preserve the past to convince a forward-looking world that old words and old ways still had meaning. He had fought for funding for academic recognition, for the simple idea that knowledge was a treasure worth protecting. In his later years, he had grown disheartened, feeling that his life's work was seen as a quaint, irrelevant hobby. Now, Clara had the chance to give his work a powerful, tangible legacy. She picked up the phone and called her financial advisor. "I want to set up a charitable foundation," she said, her voice filled with a new and powerful conviction. "It will be called the Alistair Vance Institute for Historical Linguistics and Paleography." She dedicated a significant portion of her remaining funds to create the institute. Its mission would be to provide grants to underfunded academics and students who, like her grandfather, were passionate about preserving and translating endangered and ancient languages. It would fund the digitization of decaying manuscripts, support field research, and most importantly, show the world that these dead languages still had the power to speak, to protect, and to change lives. In a matter of weeks, Clara Vance, the former waitress, had become a philanthropist, the head of a preservation trust, and the director of an academic institute. She had not just escaped her old life. She had transformed it into something meaningful, something that would echo long after she was gone. Her final act of transformation was personal. She enrolled in night classes at Columbia University, the same institution where her grandfather had taught to formally complete the PhD in historical linguistics she had abandoned a decade earlier. Walking onto that campus, no longer as a grieving daughter forced to drop out, but as a confident woman in charge of her own destiny, was a victory sweeter than any sum of money. One evening, as she was poring over a text in her new quiet study, her phone buzzed. It was a news alert. Disgraced CEO Marcus Thorne files for personal bankruptcy, cites crippling legal fees and reputational damage. The article detailed his fall from grace, the loss of his company, his fortune, his penthouse apartment, and his status. He had become a pariah, a cautionary tale whispered on Wall Street. Clara read the headline, felt a brief, cold flicker of justice, and then deleted the notification. Marcus Thorne was a part of her past. She was busy building the future. 3 months later, Clara stood on a cliff edge at Sterling Headland, the wind tasting of salt and ancient stone. The wild, rugged beauty of the landscape surpassed any photograph. Beside her, William Sterling, now a dear friend, pointed towards the churning North Sea. "Wise view," he said, explaining how the land's original sealer had intended for it to be protected forever. As they walked the grounds, William showed her the ancient standing stones and the ancestral quay that Marcus Thorne would have demolished for a golf course. Instinctively, Clara placed a small stone on the pile, a simple, quiet act of a guardian fulfilling her duty. She finally understood her grandfather's lessons. She hadn't abandoned his world. She had been preparing to defend it. Her new purpose felt as solid as the rock beneath her feet. Back at William's ancestral home, her phone rang. It was Sophie, her voice stronger and more full of life than it had been in years. The experimental treatment in Boston was working miracles. "The doctors are amazed, Clara," she said, her voice bubbling with joy. "They said I might be able to come home for Christmas." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, tears of pure relief. Everything she had fought for felt real in that moment. Sophie's future was secure. Her joy was interrupted by an urgent email from her solicitor with the subject line, "An interesting development." It contained a scanned report from an academic consultant in Oslo addressed to Marcus Thorne and dated 6 months before their meeting. Clara's blood ran cold as she read it. The document was a complete, accurate translation of the Sterlingness Covenant. It detailed the heritage clause, the forfeit of all buildings upon breach, and the interpreter's endowment. Thorne had known. He had been aware of every clause, every risk, every detail of the 1,000-year-old trap. He hadn't been an ignorant fool. He had been a supremely arrogant gambler betting his entire empire on the belief that no one else on Earth, especially not a waitress, could possibly possess the same knowledge. His sneer at Aurelion hadn't been a statement of fact. It had been a desperate prayer. The depth of his hubris was the true cause of his ruin. A year to the day after that fateful night at Aurelion, Clara Vance stood at a podium in a lecture hall at Columbia University. The room was packed with students and professors, all there to hear the founder of the Alastair Vance Institute. Gone was the weary waitress. In her place stood a confident scholar, her voice clear and strong. She told her story, emphasizing that a language deemed dead had saved a living landscape and dismantled a corporate empire. Marcus Thorne's downfall wasn't just a linguistic loophole, she explained to the rapt audience. It was a failure of arrogance. He was defeated by his inability to see worth in a person he considered invisible. Her message resonated deeply, inspiring a young student who confessed that Clara Ara's story had convinced her not to abandon her own useless field of study. Later, Clara Ara sat in a sunlit garden with a healthy, vibrant Sophie whose sketchbook was filled with drawings of the Sterling headland. The $1 million had been the key, but purpose was the home it had unlocked. She had traded the clatter of plates for the quiet rustle of ancient manuscripts. She was a guardian, a philanthropist, and a sister whose promise was kept. The weight of whispers was gone, replaced by the power of her own voice, ready to write an unwritten future. Clara Ara's incredible journey reminds us that the most valuable assets we possess are often the ones others can't see: our knowledge, our integrity, and our courage. She proved that one person armed with a skill that the world deemed useless could topple an empire built on arrogance. Her story is a powerful testament to the idea that true strength isn't about the title on your door or the money in your bank account, but about the hidden value you carry within yourself. It's a reminder to never underestimate the quiet person in the room. If Clara's story of justice and hidden strength inspired you, make sure to hit that like button to help us share it with the world. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that knowledge is the ultimate power, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories where the underestimated rise up. What did you think of Marcus Thorne's epic downfall? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next